Welcome, whoever you are, even however you're clothed. The subject of this talk tonight is the 12th, 13th of October 1941, when Oldham was bombed. This is not to be confused with the early morning of Christmas Eve 1944, when a V-1 rocket severely damaged part of Abbey Hills Road. On both occasions, 27 people died. More were injured, many became temporarily homeless, much property was damaged, and a sadness overtook the town. A few weeks ago, Roger asked me if I would repeat the talk I gave 10 years ago on the 70th anniversary of that 12th, 13th of October night, to acknowledge that today is the 80th anniversary. His email had a final line. It said, "Only this time it will have to be Zoomed." My heart fell. I've not long mastered WhatsApp. However, I put the problem to my technical team, my daughter's partner Steve and Rosie, my granddaughter, and they came up with a cunning plan. So my thanks are to them, to Roger, and to Sheila, who oversees the other end of the chain that leads to tonight. The plan is to have a 10-minute break partway through, and a countdown or a count-up clock will indicate the restart. This break will give you a chance to brew up, to visit the loo, put your pyjamas on, etc. It is planned that at the end of the talk there will be an opportunity to ask me questions, so you'll all need to finish at the same time. To compile this talk, I've used various sources to obtain enough information to make me feel that I've done it justice. One source are the Oldham Cemetery's burial books, which can be accessed online. This is an example. The first two names are victims of this bombing, Edwin Leatherbarrow and Florence Partington. Edward Leatherbarrow was killed at his home in Hawksley Street. I can only assume that it's got Brunlees Street on this burial book, because that is where his wife and children must have moved to after their house was destroyed that night. Sometimes the burial book puts in the cause. Burial books don't usually give the cause of death, but here are 4 casualties referred to as raid casualties. Another source is the Oldham Chronicle, which, as its title suggests, chronicle the event. No town was allowed to be mentioned, but it is possible to link some paragraphs to particular people and to particular bombs, and I shall do that. Another source is the bomb census, collated after the war, when each bomb is listed nationally and each town is indicated separately. For each bomb, there is a site given, the number of kilograms of its weight, for example 250 kilograms, the size of the crater it made, the number of people killed, and the time it landed. So the first line in my chart leads sewage works, Royton border, 250 kilograms, crater 30 feet by 6 feet, no deaths, time 23:20, 20 minutes past 11. This is an indication of the preparedness of Oldham Council, with no idea how severe any bombing might be. For example, the first one reads, shelter accommodation for 90,000. 90,000 must have been 40% of the population. And further down, 17 emergency feeding centres providing 20,000 hot meals every 2 hours. 20,000 every 2 hours. Some information can be gleaned from the deaths column in the Oldham Chronicle. These are for the 13th, 14th and 15th of October in 1941. The location of the raid was to be kept secret in the paper, but in the death notices for both Mr. and Mrs. Bowden and Mrs. Elder, there is a reference to enemy action. First line of Mr. Bowden, by enemy action. And then a line for Mrs. Elder also refers the result of enemy action. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission, apart from military deaths, also commemorates on its website civilian deaths. I downloaded all 27 from Oldham, and here they are. The local parish church in Hollingwood adds to the information. The War Memorial at St Margaret's Church has the names of victims from the parish. The first picture is of St Margaret's Church itself, and the next picture is of the War Memorial. On that War Memorial are these three entries. First of all, Mrs Elder was a victim of that bomb. Leatherbarrow and Partington, Mrs Partington, and Mrs Stott were victims as well. And finally, on this one, Amy Hughes and John Hughes. All those people died in the bombing that night. In 1991, the year of the 50th anniversary, I had a bright idea. I occasionally get them. I was the head of the history department at County School and recruited children aged about 14 to interview people and record their memories. An article in the Oldham Chronicle elicited about 30 responses. I visited each one and made sure that they were happy with the idea. So I would take 2 pairs of children in my car with a tape recorder, deposit them at a house and collect them an hour later. I suspect it wouldn't be allowed today, leaving 2 children in a stranger's home for an hour. But all the children enjoyed it, especially those who returned full of tea and biscuits. The results were very mixed. Sometimes the recorder wasn't near enough and the sound was poor. Some briefly referred to the 12th, 13th of October, but were more eager to talk about their wartime memories. But nonetheless, some interesting stories emerged. Memories of events long ago have their own difficulties, and one must be careful. One man told children that on that night the sirens sounded, he was getting ready to go to the Palladium Cinema on Union Street. Well, he wasn't, unless the cinema opened after 11:10 p.m. And remember, it was a Sunday too. I think he got that wrong. I will, however, quote some things remembered from those tapes. Apart from these reminiscences, I've used the Oldham Chronicle, although what they were allowed to report didn't mention the town where the bombing took place. Also, Rosie and I visited 4 Oldham cemeteries, because all 27 of Oldham's dead, except for 2, are buried locally. Alas, some have no headstones, but others contain the date, and some even refer to the cause of death, as we shall see. The landscape can sometimes ask questions, as can a change in building style. That too can be a sign of some past event. I also went to London to the Public Record Office at Kew, and to my delight I found information there. All of these will shed light on that bombing night, but we should recognise that, dreadful as it was as nothing to the havoc wreaked on Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol, Hull, Coventry, even London, and many, many other cities and towns. And for that we perhaps should be grateful. The 12th of October 1941 was a Sunday. Insofar as you can have a normal day in the new normal of a week in wartime, some things were normal. Manchester City 4, Stockport 3, Chester 0, Manchester United 7, Bury 5, Oldham 5. Sounds pretty normal. Being Sunday, many people would have been to church. The Hughes family of Incline Road would have been at St John's Methodist Church on Manchester Road. They always were. The father, John Willie Hughes, was a lay preacher. Amy, his wife, Ida, their daughter, John, their son, and their Guernsey evacuee, John Lennie. These made up the family. This was their normal Sunday, and that day their world turned upside down, as we shall see later. Normal could be fun. During that week, the rep was producing Robert's wife, whoever she was, and Mr. Binns told of youth clubs in church halls. Others told of the camaraderie of the pubs. People told of pictures and dancing at the Savoy. Some ladies told us of dressing up and going out. The word trapping had to be explained to the children. Mrs. Bradbury told of her delight as she embroidered, made gloves, painted pottery. All normal events. The Cron reported on ladies using billiard chalk as a substitute for eyeshadow. Others reported playing or watching the odd football match. Old habits died hard, even in wartime. But many other new things were now normal. Lighting restrictions. All street lighting will be stopped until further notice. References there to windows and skylights, putting up blankets and curtains, even fixing brown paper to the inside of glass. The blackout was normal for houses, for vehicles, for streets. Mary McTighe of Hawksley Street remembered bus windows being dolly blued to stop reflection. She remembered it as she was bringing her new baby home from hospital some months before. Walter Timms of Limeside and his friend Mr. Clowes, the monumental mason of Limeside Road, knew that they had to take care as they walked along in the dark. Or they did after they'd fallen into a large hole and had to be rescued. As Walter said, the blackout gave him a very severe black eye. Rationing was normal, both for food and for clothing. Even handkerchiefs needed coupons. That weekend, a fish shortage was reported in the Oldham Chronicle. But the Chronicle also told its readers the good news that a consignment of oranges was due. For 7 days, only children aged 1 to 6 could obtain them. That must have included me. After that, they were for older children. And the shopkeeper was instructed to make sure that he displayed every orange. Oh, and some other news, which I think is good. Canada was sending dried apples. Gas masks were also normal. Hitler will send no warning. Always carry your gas masks. And that was repeated on a host of warning signs. Immediately you hear gas present, possibly a rattle warning you, put on your respirator, and a handbell will tell you when the danger is over. They were described as a nuisance to put on. Many disliked the smell. Mary Bradshaw remembers having a special one for asthmatics. I must have had a baby one, but I don't remember. The extract from the Limeside Junior logbook. Respirator practice 2:10. Attendance this morning was very poor. Prolonged aerial activity during the night for several hours. Preliminary air raid warning received at 2:53 p.m. All clear at 4:01. That's a long time for children to be cooped up in shelters, but that's where they were. And Robert Hibbert reported we had to carry gas masks at all times, slung across the shoulders in cardboard boxes. Gas mask drill was a regular occurrence at this time, because air raids might happen at any time, and each child was given a point of no return, usually halfway between home and school. Whichever half you happened to be in when the sirens sounded, depending on whether you ran to school or ran home. In consequence, much lingering near the halfway point was evident until the last possible moment, in the hope that you could dash back home. And there you can see on that slide how awkward a gas mask could be as you went about your daily business. Shelters were normal. Dozens of the public shelters were around the town. There had been some concern over the quality of the mortar being used, and they'd all had to be checked. The government suggested you may like to make your own, and the pamphlet was issued. It recommended that you put curtains up, net curtains, use sticky tape on the windows, etc. Your home, it said, is an air raid shelter. It is emphasised that the average well-built house offers a considerable degree of protection against blast and splinters, as well as from anti-aircraft fire and splinters from anti-aircraft shells. I have no idea how many people took that aboard. Usually, people were aware of public shelters, like this brick belt shelter. A direct hit, of course, would have killed everyone, but it might save you from all the splinters. Some people had an Anderson shelter. That one looks really quite splendid, very comfortable. People remember them not so much clean and comfy as dirty, wet and smelly. Others had Morrison shelters. They were just being rolled out at the time of this bombing. We had one but the house was only obtained after the bombing. A list was provided of the Oldham surface shelters in 1941 so that people would know where to go in the event of a raid. And on this you can see, for instance, second one down, New Street between Manchester Street and Foundry Street, there was one, and the second one up, Manchester Road near Chapel Road opposite Hollingwood Reservoir. So those lists were given to everyone in the town. Alas, would you believe it, there was vandalism, and an Oldham Chronicle report pleaded with parents to keep control over their children. Much damage, it says, was being caused to oil lamps and bunks, and these needed to stop. Long working hours were normal. My father worked at Avro's. He left home at 6:30 in the morning and arrived back in time to wish me good night, so my mother told me. One lady told me that she worked from 5:30 in the morning to 5:30 in the evening. And Lois Anderton, when she was questioned by the children, and they asked her what she did in her spare time, she just laughed and pointed out that she worked until 10 o'clock at night. Spare time was not something she enjoyed, she said. Evacuees to care for were normal, and we've mentioned John Lennie, the Guernsey boy, who only had memories of great care. In one day in the summer of 1940, 600 evacuees came to Oldham. Digging for victory was normal. There were requests to the town council to allow land to be turned into allotments. Northmoor Bowling Club offered its bowling green. Strinesdale Open School offered land that was incorporated within the school grounds. The King's Arms at Grange Bar asked for permission to create a potato field. The Wagon and Horses in Manchester Road for an allotment to grow cabbages and beetroots. Even Woodfield Nursing Home offered to have some of its land ploughed over. On the flip side, there were also complaints of the theft of vegetables from the allotments. Fire watching was normal. Mrs. Bradbury, who watched in Chapel Road, had been taught how to use a stirrup pump. This one was on wheels. She said they were heavy to move around. Mr. Spencer of Northgate had just begun work as a junior in a solicitor's office. He took his turn fire watching there. Williamson's shop at Mumps advertised steel helmets, stirrup pumps, hose pipes, asbestos gloves, with the motto, "Be prepared just in case." Mildred Shaw did her fire watching at Ferranti's or on the roof of the Gem Mill on a rotor system. She remembered sleeping on palliasses, another word I had to explain to the children. The Oldham Chronicle was advertising fire watch beds for 25 shillings, but if you wanted a mattress, that would cost you 19 and sixpence, or 95 new pence. Wardens were normal. It was useful to smile at them. Mrs. Oddie of Alva Road recalled her husband out regularly, checking on people's blackout. When a bomb fell 20 yards away from Mrs. Hadfield in Green Lane, because she had a telephone, the wardens kept trudging through her dining room. The trouble was, the blast of the bomb had brought large quantities of soot down her chimney. Vacuuming, as she said, where they hadn't walked was easy. Where they had walked, it was a nightmare. People practicing for emergencies was normal and hoping they would never be needed. There were emergency food stations, rest centres, WVS, Salvation Army, St. John's Ambulance Brigade. Council Emergency Committee had 500 sets of underclothes. We will meet one of them later. The maintenance of law and order was normal. Eli Heaton of Waterloo Street should have been selling full bags of coal. He was selling them at short weight and was fined £20. That was a lot of money. That would have been getting on for a month's wages. Harold Foley of Gainsborough Avenue was caught speeding. Average speed 38 miles an hour. Mind you, if he'd been doing in the blackout, that was dangerous. He was fined £3. The Crown and Anchor in Henshaw Street was selling beer in undersized glasses. Fined 40 shillings. In July of 1940, an Oldham woman had been prosecuted for spreading rumours that the south of England was knee-deep in dead bodies. It was the fake news of the time. All of these and many more were normal. Schools and pubs and identity cards. In November of 1941 there was to be Spitfire Week. It had all become normal in abnormal times. Oh, and one other normal. Sirens. This from the Oldham Chronicle tells you that they were a regular occurrence. The first was on the 19th of June 1940 at 3:20 a.m. The average alert was every 2 to 3 days, mostly at night. The fire service logbook survives. It is full of references to sirens. The system used colours, yellow, purple, red and white. I think the siren was sounded publicly when the warning reached red, and the all clear when a white communication was received. Whatever it was, the sirens were sounding on almost a daily basis, and sometimes more than once a day. That too was normal. There isn't time to refer to the occasional sporadic but still alarming small instances of enemy action prior to this October. The Belgian mill was destroyed. Avrils was attacked in April of 1941. Bombs in High Crompton and Royton had fallen in August of 1940, so people knew what damage and alarm bombs could cause. They would have seen it on newsreels in the cinemas. Even the Guernsey evacuee John Lennie had experienced them. He had been lodged originally at Barbury near Tarporley in Cheshire. Surely that was a safe place. No, it wasn't. A landmine fell in the village. It blew the back door off the hinges and all the windows out in the house where he was staying. What he didn't know was that that experience was as nothing compared with what was to come. Jean Smith had gone with her mother to visit a relative in Wallasey. It was blitz while she was there as part of an attack on Liverpool. She'd even been bombed while on a ferry crossing the Mersey. Bombs, she said, landed on either side of the ferry on which she and her mother were sheltering under life rafts on the boat. She said it was horrendous, and so it must have been. And people knew, of course, because there was gossip. I loved this thing that appeared on my phone the other day. Pre-internet chat room using an old version of Windows. And you can almost see Mrs. Smith there telling the ladies, you know, I was on a ferry across the Mersey and these bombs were dropping on either side. And someone be saying, and you know what happened in Fern Street last night when that bomb landed? And so the message was spread as those people went into the shops and their husbands were told and they took the information to work. And so the news would spread around the town. Many Oldhamers indulged in the spectator sport of watching Manchester ablaze. Derek Fenton remembered that his house was on an incline, so he got a good view. He called it like having a tiered seat. Others recalled walking up to Glodick Lowes or Oldham Edge to watch the show. So most people would have had more than an inkling of what it was like. But no one seems to expect it to come near them. How wrong they were. And how wrong you would have been that night if you'd had the same belief and lived in Barrow or Bury or Rochdale or Bolton or Ashton-under-Lyne, all in what the government had designated Region 10. But it was Oldham that night that bore the brunt. So, set your watches for 11:20 tonight if you want to sense the moment 80 years ago when all this began. That was the time the raid started in Chadderton. 4 bombs, all given the same time of 23:20, landed there. 2 fell in open fields, 1 demolished 65 feet of an iron fence, and 1 fell on a grassy bank near the sewage works on the Royton boundary. Half an hour later, 2 more bombs hit Chadderton at 23:50. 1 fell in Foxdenton Lane, the front garden of number 98, 2 feet from the front step of the houses that were really quite new. It damaged some houses at the front, but the report notes that a small glass greenhouse 60 feet away from the crater was undamaged. It damaged some houses, and there you are, Foxdenton Lane, a mess. All these 5 bombs are described as 250 kilogram bombs. The sixth was much smaller, 50 kilograms, and fell into the back garden of 100 Foxdenton Lane next door. It damaged the wooden garage about 14 feet from the centre of the crater. The official report says that the intended target could have been Avro's and A.C. Coss's works. Anne Geary worked at Coss's, making radio valves, she thought. Only after the war were they told that they had been making parts for radar. All these bombs are described as HE, high explosive, and the official report at that point says they cannot say how many aircraft were involved or indeed of what type. So 6 bombs fell on Chadderton. No one died. But between bombs 4 and 5, the first fell in Oldham and 6 people died. When I did this talk in 2011, I dealt with each bomb in turn, chronologically. This time I shall mention some briefly and home in on 3 other incidents. At 23:45, 8 bombs landed simultaneously. 4 of them landed in Hollingwood Cemetery, 1 on the pathway and 3 among the graves and the tombs, destroying many of them and disinterring many dead bodies. It was not a pretty sight. Consequently, the cemetery was closed for a few days. All 4 bombs were the large ones, 500 kilograms, but the official report notes that glass houses within the cemetery walls were undamaged. The next morning, Mrs. McTighe, mourning the death of her husband as he'd been laying mines near Cardiff only 2 months before, and with 2 small children to care for, the following evening after these bombs, answered a knock at her door. A friend had called on his way home from work to tell her about the cemetery bombs and that she needn't worry, her husband's grave was undisturbed. She was grateful, but she told me that actually there was only sand in his coffin. She had gone to Cardiff to collect his things. There were not many things to collect, and there was nothing of him. The mine had destroyed him completely, and no part of him was ever found. His funeral was more symbolic than real, just sand in the coffin. Another bomb fell at the junction of Oak Road, Holly Lane and 5th Avenue in Limeside. Mrs. White lived 40 yards away. She recalled for the children, there was a crater. I know that it was actually 40 feet by 20 feet. She remembered a broken sewer, toilets that didn't work, and water very black coming from the taps. She remembered her brother, on hearing the siren, had said, "I'm going to bed. If one drops on 3rd Avenue, let me know." Well, it was much nearer than that. All Mrs. White could recall was that the blast blew them under the large stone kitchen table, and actually that was probably the best place to be, and no one died. This is not true of the other bomb that landed at the top of Randolph Street and Oak Road, close to Hollins Road and the Oak Pit. Mr. and Mrs. Stott, and some say a billeted soldier, but I have no proof of that, lived in a bungalow with a cellar called Lancaster House. Mr. Gerald Stott was the headmaster of Limeside Junior School. Even the official report describes what so many people reported to me in 1991, that the walls of the bungalow had disappeared, but that the roof was more or less intact and it just rested on the rubble. Mr. and Mrs. Stott had been in their cellar, but he had gone up the steps to make some tea. He'd been trapped on the cellar steps. The blast blew him out and trapped her. Another view was her husband was still in the cellar, but this appears to be wrong. And the picture there shows the shambles that had been their bungalow. The Oldham Chronicle report simply said, in another area, when the house collapsed on a married couple, the husband escaped, but the woman who could be heard directing the rescuers for some time was dead when extricated. Rosie and I found Mrs. Scott's grave in Hollingwood Cemetery. We'd taken some water and a scrubbing brush, and we cleaned it up a bit to make sure that we got at least killed by enemy action photograph. A Limesider commented, on the night of October 12th, bombs fell on Limeside. Mrs. Scott, the headmaster of the junior school's wife, was tragically killed. For that day, the log is blank. The following day, on the 13th, the logbook says, "School closed after the air raid. All the staff present except for Mr. Stott. Owing to unexploded bombs in the neighbourhood, many homes were evacuated, some to rest centres, others to stay with friends." School closed again. A skeleton staff was present all day to take charge of the few children who attended. And on the next day, school reopened. In the morning, the classes were so small, the timetable was not strictly followed. It is said that the first rescuers on the scene were miners from the Oak Pit, who began to tunnel in towards Catherine Scott, who was in fact able to speak to them. However, when the official rescue service arrived, they ordered the miners to let them take over. And in the circumstance of tunnelling, they were probably less good, and by the time they pulled her out, she was dead. There was much unease in the area. Both Mr. and Mrs. Stott were highly regarded, and people told me that Mr. Stott was never the same man again and was off work for some considerable time. Robert Hibbert, who I don't know, wrote this: "I remember vividly the night of the air raid when a bomb destroyed Mr. Stott's house in Oak Road. Next morning, crowds stood in silence as ARPs and the rescue team from miners from Oak Colliery tunnelled through the destruction in a frantic effort to reach Mrs. Stott. That, I suspect, is wrong. The miners were not on duty the following morning. They had been sent away. Corporation buses were used to clear trees and debris to assist the operation. Sadly, Mrs. Stott died, and the whole estate was shocked and deeply saddened by the loss." In London, I came across a review in 1941 that was inquiring into how badly collieries were being affected. Coal was desperately needed. To my delight, the Oak Pit, sometimes called Chamber Road Colliery, was included, and it had been bombed that night. I saw no other report of that. And if you look at this diagram, you will see it in the top right-hand corner. There are craters 1, 2, and 3. There's supposed to be a fourth one, but it's not clear where that one was. But you can see that that is some distance from the pit head, and that meant that the colliery could continue. On another page of the report, it tells of the fall in production and how on the 13th of October little was produced. But it did quickly recover. But it was realised that some of the machinery, although the bombs had not actually exploded, some of the machinery was out of kilter. And later, about 8 days over Christmas, they ceased production while the repairs were made. On another page, it does make the point that on the 12th, 13th of October, this is down the right-hand side, 40 men were kept out of the mine to render first aid repairs and the clearing of debris. Now, I don't know whether the first aid repairs were to people in the pit or in the grounds of the pit, or whether that refers to the miners who might have gone to attempt a rescue of Mrs. Stott. That isn't clear, I'm afraid. What is clear is that Hollingwood was not a safe place to be, as we shall see more clearly later on. However, another bomb landed at the other side of town, on the corner of Breeze Hill Road and Vigo Street. No one was killed, and in all the interviews that the school carried out, no one mentioned it at all. But there's more. On the corner of Werneth Hall Road and Fern Street, today you will see an open patch of land. If you check the numbers, you will see that 2 or 3 of the numbers are missing, because that is where the houses once stood. Across the road, there was frontal damage for about 30 feet. And again, you can see where the house style has changed. The entrance to the door is different on the right-hand side to the other ones. The brickwork is different. The roof line is different. It's just another sign that there had been some serious catastrophic event at that point. At that point, 10 bombs had fallen in the space of 10 minutes. Then there was a pause when 4 more fell, and it wasn't even midnight. Edward Leatherbarrow died at 26 Hawksley Street, near the side of Hollingwood Baths. He was 41 years of age. Strangely, Mrs. McTighe, also living in Hawksley Street, didn't know that a bomb had landed further up the street and exploded. She, her mother, and the 2 toddlers were hiding, sheltering in the pantry. The noise, she told me, was horrendous. There was ack-ack guns blasting forth, planes flying overhead, bombs somewhere exploding. She said, when it quietened down, we all went off to bed. Only the next day, when she saw the damage in her street, did she realise the extent of the night's events. She reckoned that her house was the only one in Hawksley Street to be undamaged. Not a mark was on it, she said. She told me that it took 3 days to find Mr. Leatherbarrow. Mrs. Leatherbarrow, who had 2 children and was expecting another, told Mary McTighe that her husband had said, I'll go up and find how things are. Went to the front door, and their house took a direct hit. He is buried in Hollingwood Cemetery. It's a new grave, different from the one that I took a photograph of 10 years ago. 2 more bombs fell at that time. Wellington Road and Newport Street had a 250-kilogram bomb which created a crater 25 feet by 12 and landed in a back garden. Near the junction of Windsor Road and Osborne Road, there was another one. This also fell in a garden and blew in part of a private basement cellar of a well-built house. The crater there was 30 feet by 20. It may have been as a result of this bomb that Harold Bagshaw was killed. The Bagshaws, as those of you of an older vintage will remember, were the principal chemists in Oldham, Braddock and Bagshaws. His obituary in the Oldham Chronicle makes no mention of it. In fact, it states that he had been gardening that day and later collapsed and died. However, he is listed as officially a civilian death resulting from the bombing. If this is the bomb that caused his death, there would have been much aerial debris, some of great size. 30 years ago, I stood outside number 171 Frederick Street and wondered if I dared knock at the door. I did, and a lovely lady answered. I told her my story, and she invited me into the rear of the house and said that where I was standing was the spot where, according to what she had heard, he died, hit by flying masonry as he stood at the open French window playing his violin. Whether that is true or not, I don't know. But his grave is in Chadderton Cemetery, just on the left at the entrance, among all the other large monuments. There is no mention of the cause of his death. At the stroke of midnight, a 250-kilogram bomb landed near St Thomas's Street and Union Street West, really Napier Street East. Number 35 had a new entrance through the roof. At an angle, passing through the party wall into the upstairs of number 37, out of the ground floor wall, and onto Napier Street East. It may have been here that Veronica McGarry died in Coffey Street. Who Olive was, I've no idea, except that she wrote a letter from 83 Napier Street East, and I'm going to read it to you. I call it my okey doke letter. Clearly, the gossip or the news had spread, and she wanted her dear Norman to know all about it. Written at the top has been added at Catterick Camp, the army camp, on the strength of this letter, obtained a weekend pass. Norman has the word little added. I assume it's not Little Norman, it's Norman Little. Olive, the writer, could be his sister, his wife, even his mother, but I suspect his sister. And this is what she wrote. It is a splendid account of the night. My dear Norman, I don't know whether you know of the excitement that prevailed in Oldham last Sunday evening or not, but I think I ought to let you know, in case you get to know from other sources and become unduly anxious. It wasn't Manchester this time, but our own hometown, which had a sharp, quick raid on Sunday morning, with rather disastrous consequences. It was about 11:10, and she's actually right with that, when the siren went, and very soon afterwards a large number of planes crossed the town. The ack-ack was fairly stiff, but beginning at Hollingwood, Garden Suburbs, Oak Pit, then Coppice, and then Cranberry Street, and finally Breeze Hill, a fair amount of damage was done. I don't know a lot of the details about Hollingwood, but there are houses down, people killed or injured. Manley Road had a bad spell, a number killed and injured and missing. Houses flattened out. Murfield Avenue also got it. Then Coppice, with that house at the corner of Fern Street and Werneth Hall Road, and craters in the road. I suppose you're wondering, since it got so near to 83, our house, how that house fared. The roof of the scullery is practically gone. There is a wire hanging down where the light used to be. We found a piece of curbstone or flag or chimney pot in the kitchen, which must have been blown in. A piece of stone was also blown things through to the middle bedroom window. Glass all over the place. The electric light throughout the house has gone, both power and light, but maybe it's now been restored by this time, but I don't know. A house in Napier Street, number 35, got a bomb. It didn't go off, but only the house it let on was damaged. Had it gone off, I'm afraid I should be telling a very different story. The people were injured, but not how badly I don't know. From our house to the end was roped off this morning. Clark's next door, but one to the Mumfords, had their window blown out. Large-sized stones have penetrated many roofs. When I looked out of the bedroom window this morning, stones were all over everybody's roof. The pavement just looks like it had rained with dust and grit and rubble. What happened up Lees, I don't know. That's my story, kid. So you see, after the short, sharp spell, we're all quite well, whole and in peace, and hope you are too. Of course, in the shop, it is all the topic of conversation. There are some really gruesome and harrowing stories being told, but I will not record them for your chaste ears. So, okie doke, Olive. Now that is really good historical evidence. It's from someone, an eyewitness, someone involved in it, writing immediately afterwards, not remembering many years later. And it gives you a really good grasp of the shambles that night was causing around the town. 5 minutes later, at midnight, the grocer came, or rather, his cabbages and beetroot did. This bomb landed on those allotments behind the Wagon and Horses on Manchester Road at the end of Herndon Street. Mr. Binns, who lived across the road at the Smut Inn, told me that Manchester Road was awash with vegetables, and not a ration book inside. The crater was 90 feet by 20 feet, 90 feet, 30 yards by 7 yards. He told me that the trapdoor of the cellar of the Smut had been lifted up by the blast of this bomb and deposited on Manchester Road. Yet despite the blackout, no one had fallen down his cellar. But next morning, the driver of the first tram down Manchester Road failed to spot the large wooden metal cellar door across the tram lines, ploughed into it. But worse was still to come. At 12 minutes past midnight, 2 bombs landed in Sheridan Street, off New Road, and off New Road, Manley Road. At that moment, New Road ceased to look very new. But 6 minutes later came the really destructive bomb. Yet this was only a 250-kilogram bomb, only. The amount of damage was considerable to property, as this picture shows. A visit today enables you to see where the houses have been rebuilt. Manley Road and Murfield Avenue, different brick, different lintels, different door frames. There is that gap clearly indicated by a change in the building. But what was worse than all that was the loss of life. In Manley Road, 6 people died. In Murfield Avenue, another 5 people died. In a radius of less than 100 yards, 11 people were killed. This includes 4 members of the Jowett family at 15 Murfield Avenue. Mother, father, 4-year-old Eileen, and Grandma Isabella Mills. In Manley Road, George and Esther Bowden died, and they are buried in Haywood Cemetery. And also dying that night, Sadie Raymond. In the Oldham Chronicle, I came across this quotation, and it mentions Mr. Bowden. In one house, minus a roof, was found the bank book belonging to Mr. Bowden, who had died from injuries received, and whose home had been levelled to the ground. Mr. Bowden was a very interesting character. In his younger days, he'd served for a long period in the army, being stationed for many years in India. In addition, the official notification of the deaths in Oldham included those in the Jowett household: Isabella Mills, the grandmother, Candace, daughter, Eileen, the child, and Fred, the husband, all dying on the 13th of October at 15 Murfield Avenue. We found their grave in Grenicus Cemetery. We cleaned it up again, and so it looks quite reasonably easy to read. You'll see too, about 5 or 6 lines down, killed by enemy action, October the 13th, 1941, 15 Murfield Avenue, and then the 4 victims. We failed to find a grave for Lily Jones, but this I did find in the newspaper. Police War Reserve W.G. Jones was looking over the shambles that was once his home when he noticed an object on a building situated a short distance away. A member of a demolition squad succeeded in securing the article, which turned out to be a framed photograph of Mr. Jones and his wife who had been killed, a photograph taken on their wedding day. The frame and the glass were undamaged. In another case, a wallet containing a large sum of money was blown out of a house and found a considerable distance away. Large paving stones had been found on the roof of a building 150 yards away from where the bomb burst. So many people suffered, not from the bomb itself, but from the debris that was flying around. This notice, however, did appear in the Oldham Chronicle. Lily Jones of Murfield Avenue died the 13th of October, 1941. Sadie Raymond was also killed that night, and we found her grave in Grenicus Cemetery. It's a very obvious grave. Alas, the writing on it is very difficult to read. It's a grey stone with silvery type letters, but we cleaned it and it is now visible. Sadie Frances Raymond killed that day. Strangely, I received very little information about this area of bombing, Manley Road and Murfield Avenue. Mrs. Sharpwell, who lived in the Green Lane in the Garden suburbs, has told me that her friend's cousin lived there, and though a bomb went through the house, or perhaps it was a curbstone that went through the house, not a single drinking glass in her glass cabinet was broken. And if that's all I could find out, it hardly does justice to such a traumatic time. And Mrs. Haywood recalled for the children that she went to check on her sister in nearby Lee Street the following day. They were okay, but next door had a large hole in the roof, another airborne cobblestone or paving stone. Just imagine this. The people told her that whatever it was, curbstone perhaps, that it came through the roof, through the bedroom floor, hit the flagged floor, split in two. One part went into her lounge and smashed the fireplace, and the other bounced through the kitchen window. She said, "We were so lucky." And I suppose really they were. She said she walked to the mess of Murfield Avenue, and there was a piano on a rooftop leaning against a chimney stack, and all the roofs were full of bits of timber, stones and bricks. I would love to find a picture of the piano on the roof, but I haven't been able to find it. Bad though that last bomb had been, and because I received such little information about it, I want to mention those three other serious bombing incidents. The first of these incidents took place at 2340, the first bomb in Oldham proper. It was a 50-kilogram bomb and the first that killed in Oldham. It landed on a road near the junction of Cranberry Street and Moorhay Street, and 6 people died. That picture tells its own story. The Cranberry Inn, of course, is on the left, and you can just see the letters Inn, INN, on the edge of the screen. Mrs. Oddie, then aged 33, recalls grabbing her clothes and getting into the Anderson shelter in the backyard of 82 Cranberry Street. Then her father left. He was an air raid warden, and he went off to check the blackout. 30 years ago, she didn't know how much warning the sirens had given. If she was here, I could now tell her that the first sirens went off at 23:06. She had 34 minutes notice. Mr. Burns lived in Roundthorne Road, only 5 doors from Cranberry Street. He remembers hearing the terrific noise of the anti-aircraft guns in Alexander Park. He said they shook the windows. But being nosy, I went outside. He said I got as far as the path when I heard a shout, "Get down!" And there was an almighty crash. He said his body lifted up and went down. The earth moved, literally. And then he heard what damage had been caused. He said a little man, and the patron of the Cranberry Inn walking along the street, was heard to exclaim, more in sorrow than in anger, "Bloody hell, they've bombed the Cranberry! They've bombed the bloody inn!" He doesn't seem to be bothered about the houses, just the state of the pub. In fact, the pub, as you can see, was completely destroyed and not rebuilt for 22 years. The pub was number 26 and 28 Cranberry Street, but the deaths were in the houses, 6 in all. 2 people died in number 29, 1 person in number 27, and another person in number 25, and 2 people in number 22. 10 years ago, I went to look at Cranberry Street. The new pub had now become 2 houses. All the rest of the street was made up of new houses, and I took my photographs. I sat back in my car, and then I noticed 2 people walking up the road towards me who would have seen me taking the photographs. I wound the window down and told them why I was there. The elderly lady said, "My dear sister was killed that night. My father forbade any mention of it, and I didn't know about it until after he had died and my mother told me. I asked her what the family name was, and she said Witham, and she was right. Muriel Witham, aged 4, of 27 Cranberry Street, died that night." This is from the Oldham Chronicle. And this is her grave in Lee's Cemetery. You can make out 5 lines down, Muriel, the beloved daughter. And then it says the date, died October the 13th, 1941, 84 years. Her grave is in Lee's Cemetery. When I gave the talk 10 years ago, that lady came to my talk. She said, to hear my little sister remembered. A near miss that night was Lois Anderson, in what had once been the chip shop next door to the public house. Lois had been in bed. She told the children, "I thought I'd rather be in bed, so I was. I'd heard the sirens before, so I tucked my head under the blankets and went to sleep." She woke up, she said, in the middle of a lot of noise, confusion, digging and pulling, and the horrible smell of brick dust. What was worse, would you believe, was that I only had my nightie on and my hair in curlers. What a mess I looked. Eventually Lois was pulled out, pushed into an ambulance, taken to a first aid post. She had a big gash on her forehead which she showed the children, a faint mark. And then there she got 3 emergency stitches. She was put into another ambulance with a blanket round her shoulders. She had to stop the ambulance to be sick, and eventually she arrived at a rest centre, Salem Moravian Church. She said it was lovely there. I was given a bed and really well looked after. They found me new clothes, a 3-piece suit, tweed with a long black skirt, a pair of beautiful lizard skin shoes. I felt like a film star. But you remember those underwear packs that the council had? They gave her one of those. Underneath, she said, they gave me a pair of grey flannel briefs. She remembered that Ethel Shaw and her 8-year-old son Peter died, found, she said, on the cellar steps. Their grave is in Grenicus Cemetery, and it is not easy to read. The letters have started to fall off, but you can just about manage the word Ethel, and further down you'll see the name Peter, and you will see that it says, or seems to say, killed by enemy action. Rose and John Eade also died in Cranberry Street, and we could find no grave. But they are recorded in the official list, and there they are. We tried to find the grave of John Stevenson, who also died that night. We found only what was left of it. Stevenson treasured memories. The memories are no longer seeming to be treasured. As I said, Hollingwood was not a safe place to be. In fact, Hollingwood was a dangerous place to be 80 years ago today. The official report states at one point 15 enemy aircraft were involved. To be an incline road where it meets Chapel Road was especially hazardous, not least because just below the road surface was a major 30-inch gas main and a 12-inch water main. The 500-kilogram bomb landed on them, and the resultant fire lit up the sky. The official report reads, the 30-inch gas main caught alight and lit up the area, which enabled attackers to see over a large area, and 5 people died in Incline Road. Amy Mills of Incline Road didn't die for 6 months. She was badly injured, but she remained alive until April of 1942, by which time she was living at Grange Avenue, and the official report includes that fact. She appears to have been visiting Incline Road that night and was seriously injured. The official list of the Second World War civilian deaths, with a certificate from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, include her, but she is not on the appropriate page of the Oldham War Memorial, and soon I will inform the Oldham Council and hope that by April the 20th, when the page turns, her name will be on it. Ernest Taylor was only 16, but fire watching and died. He lived at number 11 on Incline Road. Florence Partington's son was on HMS Kelly with Louis Mountbatten. She died at home in Incline Road, and we found her grave in Hollingwood Cemetery. Her name in the middle there, and then on the close-up. Amy Hughes and her son John, aged 13, both died at number 6, and there will be more about them in a moment. Also lost completely that night in Incline Road was St Margaret's Institute, fondly remembered as a large, stylish building. Mr Cahoon told me that it had 4 billiard tables and a dance hall upstairs. Clearly of some architectural merit, it was reckoned to be a landmark in Hollingwood, which didn't have many buildings of any architectural merit. That was until the bomb dropped. You've seen the before, now you see the after. The Chronicle report, not able to mention Oldham of course, had these words: when a bomb fell in the centre of a street at a church institute and a house attached to it were entirely demolished, and the son of the caretaker was killed. Several houses on the opposite side were badly damaged, a mother and son being killed, that's Mrs Hughes and her son, but a school a few yards away escaped. What it could have added was that all the windows were blown out. Windows and roofs of other houses in the neighbouring streets were broken. The vicar was engaged in rescue work. Some of the debris, while he was doing that, pinned him down. When extricated, he was found to be suffering from many bruises and shock and was taken home in the ambulance, but was out again on Monday. This is what they meant by badly damaged. The mother and son were Amy and John Hughes. Mr Hughes, his daughter Ida, survived that night, as did the Guernsey evacuee, John Lennie. For Ida it had been a good day until then. It had been her 10th birthday. When I spoke to her at her home in Greenfield, she told me that there had been a party. Ida died some years ago, but today would have been her 90th birthday. Every year on her birthday, she had to remember that her mother and her brother died. The evacuee, John Lennie, had been in the house and he survived. She told me that she and John Lennie were still in touch and went to visit each other. She gave me his address in Guernsey, and I wrote to him, and he sent me, and indeed the children, his account of that night, written in his Guernsey church booklet. I'd like to read you a little bit of his account. He wrote this: my next billet was in the home of Mr William Hughes, a Methodist local preacher. Here I settled to a more familiar way of life with 2 children in the family, John aged 12 and Ida aged 9. We attended St John's Methodist Church, Hollingwood, and were very much involved. I was just settling in and getting to know the family when we had an air raid, which was to play an important part in my life. After Ida's 10th birthday celebrations on October the 12th, 1941, a date never to be forgotten, as midnight struck, the siren sounded. That's timing is wrong, of course, just as it had done many times before, to herald an attack mainly on Manchester, some 5 miles away. But almost immediately we heard a bomb screaming down. John and I were still in bed, despite having been called some seconds before to get up and get dressed. This was the last I knew for some time. I cannot recall for how long, but on coming to, found myself buried under the debris. We had gone from the bedroom to the floor below, and I could feel bricks and heavy masonry and flagstones from the pavement on top of me, and the smell of gas from the shattered mains. I can recollect very vividly praying earnestly as I waited for help. I could move my hands a little and clawed desperately to get out, but to no avail. Before long, although it seemed an eternity, firemen came and dug me out. A very slow job. I was able to tell them that John was buried too. I learned later that he had been killed, and minutes later his mother also died. The 2 of them had been in bed next to each other. One dies, the other lived. Mother had been in the front room, and that of course was where the gas main went up and killed her. He goes on, 3 of us survived. Ida and her husband celebrated their 40th anniversary helped us to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the liberation of the Channel Islands with us in May 1985. That night we went into the shelter for the rest of the raid, and an Anglican curate placed me in the care of his wife, first of all giving me a much-needed bath. I was caked in mud, quite a shocked, forlorn and sorry sight, and still only in my pyjamas. Next evening I was reunited with the Hughes family and told of the tragic death of two of that family, a traumatic time for us all. Mr. Hughes's brother Robert and his wife Alice took me in, and I stayed with them for some time. Mother and son are buried in Hollingwood Cemetery in a family grave, with this addition. And when we went to take the photograph, Rosie noticed round the corner on the side of the plinth that John Webster Hughes is specifically named, age 13, and the words killed by enemy action air raid, October the 12th, 1941. On Incline Road, as in the other places, a change in the building styles gives a clue as to where the damage was at its greatest. There you can see the newer houses and the older ones on the right hand side, and there again a closer view of that, the old bay windows and the newer brick of the rebuild. Mrs. White remembered that all the windows of Hollingwood School were blown out and they had an extended holiday. Mrs. Bradshaw told me that the keys from the Institute piano, and I mean the black and white ivory keys, not the keys to the front door, told me that the Institute piano keys were found up Hollins Road near the colliery. Mildred Shaw, living close by in Clovelly Avenue, was glad to get out of bed and went to the shelter at the Devon Field, her mum carrying the policies under her arm as they went. When Mildred returned home, to her horror she found a large stone from the Institute lying across her bed. There was a hole in the roof. The kitchen extension was no longer extended. Most of the furniture was smashed. Only the mirror that had slid down the wall was intact. Mrs. Weems' parents lived on Chapel Road, very close to Incline Road. Her father had stayed in bed. Another coping stone, while he was in bed, came through the roof, went down by the side of his bed, missing him by about 18 inches and wedging itself in the bedroom floor. Mr. Weems remembered that the next day his father loosened it from the floorboards and carried it out. After the roof came in that night, Mrs. Weems' parents crawled to the Devon Mill covered in soot. There was masonry flying all around. Mary McTighe, remember the lady whose husband died in Cardiff, told me that her sister lived in Farron Road, parallel to Incline Road, and that night they were having a party. When Mary's sister said, that's a lot of noise, I can't bomb whatever, she was told, it's only noise, just get the supper ready. Short while later they heard an engine and thought it was a taxi. It was in fact a fire engine. The whole of the top end of Incline Road was well ablaze. They hadn't even realised that there had been a raid. Not so much blaze as blasé. The next morning they found a curbstone embedded in their front garden. It had come right over their roof from Incline Road. Edith Warburton lived in Green Lane, but that night had chosen to visit a friend in Linton Avenue, 50 yards from that Incline Road bomb. Little did she know that it was a very wise decision. She said, I went out to see if I could help. There were great flames, curbstones, paving stones, bricks, slates, and I picked my way through the rubble. An air raid warden saw me and said, what are you looking for? I said, to help, I'm a first aider. And his reply was, I'm sorry, love, this lot's beyond the help of a first aider. You'd better be getting back to a shelter. I don't know if the shelter meant the home that she'd come from or the nearest public shelter. And if you look at number 5 here, Hollins Road Methodist School on Hollins Road was only some 100 yards away from where she was in Linton Avenue. We will meet Edith again later. The final bomb before midnight was in Green Lane in the Garden suburb. 5 minutes to midnight when it landed. It too was a 500-kilogram bomb. It made a crater in the road 15 yards by 3 yards. It too hit a gas main and caused a serious fire. It is this bomb that I claim to remember. Hiding under the staircase of 38 Green Lane in my mother's arms as the bomb fell. I remembered Dad and Uncle running out. and remember no more. But Mum confirmed what I was remembering. My dad was an auxiliary fireman, but only on Monday evenings, and this was a Sunday. But he nonetheless ran out, and was told off by a warden for lighting a cigarette. He pointed out that there was a big fire going on all around them. 10 years ago, my notes said, "If there's time, tell the Mr. Piatt story." There wasn't then, but there is now. I'm telling the Mr. Piatt story. Mr. Piatt was a lovely man, and he responded to my chronicle piece for memories of that night. I went to Greenfield to see him. He told me it would be better if he took me along the route that he went that night. We got into my car. He didn't take me. I took him. He had been a pupil in the sixth form at the Oldham High School, the predecessor of Council School. He had volunteered for war work when the headmaster had read out the requests, and he was appointed as a messenger. Later, he had rescued some of the written material of that night as it had been put into a skip. He gave me a copy of his diary of that night, which I'd like to read and take you on his journey. He told me to drive to Chamber Road and park in a side street, Medway Road. He pointed to this bedroom window and said, "I'd just got into bed in that room when I heard the sirens." That would be 8 minutes past 11. So I jumped out of bed. "Now drive up Chamber Road." What he said there to me is not quite what he wrote, but we'll see that in a minute. "Now drive up Chamber Road." He definitely did that. About here, he hit the dashboard as if for an emergency stop, and I hit the brake. This, he told me, was where he'd leapt off his cycle as a bomb exploded. And for a moment, Mr. Piatt was back on this spot as if it was October the 12th, 1941. I thought he was going to leap out of the car and reenact the prescribed shape on the pavement that he'd been told to adopt to reduce the risk of injury, as he'd done all those years before. But he didn't leap out of the car. "Drive on," he said, "and turn into Heron Street." And so I did. There's the Heron Mill in the background. We drove along Heron Street, and then he directed me up various side streets until we got to Corona Avenue. That's one of the side streets. There's Corona Avenue. As we approached Hollins Road, he pointed to a detached house. This one. That, he told me, was the rest centre for him and his colleagues. There they would brew up and take their ease when they were not on duty. But his aim that night was across Hollins Road to the garage still there, then known as Hemingway's Garage. It was, or the back corner was, their communications centre, where orders were received and people like him delegated to carry out instructions. The Green Lane bomb exploded at 5 minutes to midnight, and I want to read his notes to you. He wrote this: "It was just an ordinary evening at Hemingway's. I signed on duty about 19:15, 15 minutes past 7, and the other messenger, Eric Guest, who booked in at 7 o'clock. Air raid message yellow had been received in the office at 7 o'clock, but that was nothing unusual, and we carried on with our normal activities, table tennis, chatting. And then the message white was received, meaning the alert was cancelled, and that came in at 7:45. We both went across to the station house in Corona Avenue for a mug of tea at 9 o'clock, and as all seemed quite uneventful, we both signed off at 10 o'clock. It took me about 4 minutes on my cycle to get home, where my supper was ready and I was soon in bed. I tuned in my radio to the home service, which I listened to until the transmission went off just before 11. About 10 minutes later, it's correct there, the sirens went. But because the sirens sounded nearly every night at that time and nothing happened, I turned over in bed and got ready to go to sleep. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of a bomb falling, a very distinctive noise like a jet aircraft flying low overhead. I at once got up, putting on my uniform and my Wellington boots, on the wrong feet, as I found later. Going downstairs as my parents got up, I put on my steel helmet and pushed my bike out into the street, that is, Chamber Road. Pedalling off up the road, the vision was not a problem in the blackout. There seemed to be a sort of twilight which enabled me to see things clearly. And so he recounts this journey, slightly different from what I remember him telling me. Nearing Val Street, I heard the second bomb falling and I immediately hit the deck. That's the fire service expression and meant me diving flat on the ground with my arms under my helmet shielding my face. This was a necessary action to minimize injury from bomb blasts, which could be serious. Immediately after the explosion, I cycled on up Chamber Road again until I reached Cash Gate, where I once more went flat as the third bomb came down. Turning round into Heron Street, I'd only gone 40 yards when I hit the deck again as a fourth bomb came down. Now, looking at the time scale of these bombs must be the Chadderton bombs, which are a little bit of a distance away. In the fleeting moment of diving flat, I was conscious of a woman standing at the front door nearby, and my hands scraping into fine grit which is now covering the pavement and still falling. Well, where's this grit coming from if the bombs are in Chadderton? I suppose it's possible. On getting up this time, it was no longer twilight, the scene now being lit by an orange glow coming from the Hollins Road end of Heron Street. Well, if by that he's thinking of Green Lane bomb, which would make sense, he's wrong, because the Green Lane bomb had not yet been dropped. All this time there was a menacing low hum of aircraft that could be heard, together with a pinpoint white light of anti-aircraft shells bursting in the sky. There was now a lull, and racing along Hearn Street I turned up Repton Avenue, then right into Lindus Road, then left just as I heard a fifth bomb falling. Getting up again, I soon turned right into Corona Avenue, crossing Hollins Road to the station main gate, where I was met by leading fireman Jack Richardson standing there. He said to me, "What are you doing out here? Don't you know there are bombs falling?" To which I replied, "I just had to get here," and I put my bike just inside the door. Then he goes on. Time 11:45. Things were hotting up. More part-time and more full-time men were coming in to report for duty when a sixth bomb was heard falling, and I took cover on the garage floor, diving under the tennis table for extra protection. I don't see there'd be much extra protection there. Only to be met by Eric Knowles, his colleague, in a head-on collision coming under the table from the opposite side. A few minutes later, the same thing happened again with the sound of a seventh bomb, but this time without the heads colliding. Fireman Sutley came in from the direction of Copse saying it was damn sure the German aircraft machine gunning people in the street. I've heard no other reports of that. Meanwhile, other men came in with information that a bomb had been dropped in the middle of Green Lane, bringing down the houses on either side and setting fire to the gas main, and this message was telephoned to the subdivisional headquarters in Ashcross Street. And in return another message came in by phone that the headquarters was sending out reinforcements with a major pump. That's the moment I discovered that my boots were on the wrong foot. Things were quieting down now. He's obviously missed a big chunk out there. And at 1 o'clock, fireman Bill Turner came back from Green Lane, his face blackened with smoke, to say that leading fireman Garside had put the gas main fire out. And you know what he said he'd done to do that? He got a ball of clay and stuffed it in the hole in the gas main. How he got that close, I do not know, and it is not stated. But I've come across that comment before. He said he said others were standing by in case of fire in the houses and helping the rescue men working on the bombed houses. They pulled one old woman out, dead as a doornail. About this time someone came across from the station house in Corona Avenue with a large tray of mugs of hot coffee, plenty of sugar and rum in them. About 2:20 a phone message went out to headquarters to say the fire was now out in Green Lane and the pump was returning to station. I'm not quite sure when the all clear sounded, but I think we all, except full-time men, went home about 3 o'clock. Clearly, from his report, though there are errors in the timing, there is an indication of some mayhem. A shortage of fire engines. Remember all these bombs exploding around the town, and they simply didn't have enough fire engines to cope. There were serious incidents everywhere. A plan was in place, but that plan was already very stretched. The Green Lane bomb landed in the middle of the road. 6 houses were demolished, and one elderly lady with the wonderful name of Zipporah Elder was killed. I'd never heard of the word Zipporah. I guessed it was an Old Testament word name. I looked it up, and if you want to look up Exodus chapter 2, verse 21, you'll find it's the name of Moses' wife. This Zipporah Elder, was aged 82. She died that night. Mrs. Hadfield told me that her and Mrs. Elder's doctor, Mr. Adler, both told her that Zipporah died of shock. Others tell me that she was under the slab in the pantry and it fell on top of her. Oh, yeah, that'd be quite a shock. The Chronicle added a reference to a daughter, but no one ever mentioned that to me. It also mentioned something of interest to golfing readers. The Oldham Chronicle said, in another suburb, a big crater was formed in the roadway and houses on both sides failed to withstand the explosion, a woman being killed in one of them, but her daughter escaped. 2 bombs fell on a golf course, that's Wernth Golf Course and Green Lane, making craters in the 5th fairway and near the 18th tee. Beware, golfers, beware of larger bunkers. Zipporah is buried in Chadderton Cemetery, and there she is mentioned towards the foot of that stone, and there is the close-up of that, and the reference killed by enemy action. 6 houses were completely wrecked, and others needed considerable repair. That is what I mean by considerably wrecked. 20 years ago, you could still see where roofs had been repaired with different types of slate and tiles. I went very recently. It's less obvious now. Nearby roofs seem to have had an upgrade. So these pictures are from 10 years ago. There's the first and second one, and there is the third one. You can see that the repairs that have been made. And you can also see where the houses have been replaced. There in the middle is the brick house, the new build, and on either side the original garden suburb houses. And the next slide shows it even better. On the right hand side, the brick of the new houses and the old design of the garden suburb houses. A couple of quick stories. Mrs. Warburton, remember she'd gone to visit a friend in Linton Avenue. Well, her parents lived in Green Lane. Her husband was away in the service in the Orkneys at the time. And her parents knew that their daughter's house, because they lived only a few doors away themselves, had been completely wrecked. But they didn't know where she was. But no body had been found alive or dead. And someone must have mentioned that Edith had gone to Linton Avenue. Someone must have known. And after the air warden's rebuff to her about could she help as a first aider, she saw another air raid warden going from door to door, and she heard him shout using her name. The message then went back to her parents that she was okay. The message to her was that her home was a wreck and she must not go home that night. It was too dangerous. Next morning she did go home. She got to the lane that was roped off, but she managed to persuade people that their house was down there, and she was allowed to walk down Green Lane. She told me about the crater outside her house, and she mentioned too the fireman with the lump of clay putting out the fire. Then she saw her house. The front had gone completely. The bedroom floor, she said, sloped down towards the ground floor and was partly resting on the back of the settee. This was a highly polished bedroom floor. She said she spent that morning before the raid polishing it vigorously. She said, we couldn't afford our bedroom carpet, but I wanted it to look good. And there it was, still looking good, just at the wrong angle. Mr. Spencer, who became a Lancaster bomber pilot, reckoned that as he heard the Green Lane bomb whistling down, it was the scariest moment of his life. It also, as with other people, swept the chimney. He said being a pilot in the air was safer. He did the same at Mr. and Mrs. Shotwell's at number 64. She told me that her husband had just had a bath before the soot came down. She told me that her husband's main concern was not the badly damaged roof. He was only 4 or 5 houses away from where the bomb landed. He wasn't bothered too much about the broken windows. His concern was for his treasured radiogram. He tried it, and lo and behold, it worked. Perhaps the best known photograph from the bombing of Oldham is this one taken of 2 ladies rescuing bits and pieces the following morning. They are in Green Lane. I discovered their names when I was invited to visit one of them 20 years ago. Jean Smith is on the right, and her friend Elsie Cooper is on the left. Now, Jean's brother was Ron Smith, Doris's husband, and he is behind his sister, Jean, and the little chap there is a Mr. Sims. Jean had been at number 6 Green Lane, where her brother Ron and his wife Doris lived. But Jean, when the sirens went off, wanted a helmet, which was at her own house further down the lane, and Doris went with her. And they got to the house, and they went in the house, and then bang. I went to see Doris and Ron. I found out where they'd moved to from Green Lane, as I knew them as a child, and I tracked them down and I went to see them. And I was showing them this picture, and Ron said, "That lady is my sister." And I said, "Where is she now?" And he said, "I haven't spoken to her for years, but her name and her number's in my phone book." And he got the phone book and he phoned her. And I spoke to her. She was called Mrs. Turpin then. And she started to tell me, and I said, "Stop, I can't write all this down. Please, can I come and see you with my tape recorder? Just tell me where she lived." I visited her in Southport. The blast, she said, went through the house where she and Doris were, sliced off the front, that's the front that's been sliced off on the screen, blew the furniture out of the sitting room, through the wall into the dining room behind. The piano fell forward and was tipped onto the table. Where was Doris? Wedged between the piano and the table. Doris said, "I wasn't hurt, but I was frightened," and I bet she was. In the meantime, Doris's husband Ron and his father, both ARP wardens, are gone out on duty. This is Ron in his ARP splendour. Of course, he'd heard that a bomb had dropped in Green Lane where he lived. He didn't know exactly where, and so he nipped back home. He could find neither his wife nor his sister, and he had no idea where they were. I asked Jean, "Well, where were you?" And she said, "We got out at the back of the house onto Elm Road. Noting as we left that the family bike would be no good, it was in the garden shed, and there was a chimney pot on the top of that." In fact, there was no bike, there was no shed, there was just a chimney pot on a heap of wood. The next morning they were allowed in briefly, as this picture shows, hopefully to find clothes, but they couldn't find them. Jean said, "I didn't even have a clean pair of knickers," which annoyed me terribly. What she did find were some tins of food. But she did find, she said, the tomato ketchup. Remember the little chap, Mr. Sims, behind them in that photograph? He had a grand piano, and that survived, but not all of his house did. Mrs. Hadfield, who lived down the corner in Croft Brow, who I went to visit in Nottingham, told me that the family got a new catchphrase out of this event. She said Mr. Sims needed Mr. Hadfield, her husband, to help him to get the grand piano into the garden pavilion to store it, as his house was a wreck. But first he whispered to Mr. Hadfield, "Would you give me some help in the bathroom?" Eyebrows were raised. Once there, an embarrassed Mr. Sims explained, "I've lost my teeth. They're in a tumbler in the bathroom and I can't find them." So in the Hadfield household, whenever the sirens sounded and the family made off to the shelter, they could be heard shouting, "Don't forget to put your teeth in." I assume each area of the town had been surveyed and a diagram published to assist in a crisis. This is the garden suburb one, and you'll see the blacked out bits which were coloured on the original indicate that there was something of significance in each of those houses. And the key will show you that. Doctor, a telephone, action station, a hydrant, infirm resident, danger point. I tried to check on some of those, and it seemed to me to be a bit out of date. Certainly, Zipra Elder was infirm, and she is not shown. There's no indication on that map where she lived that she would be infirm at her 82-year-old. But anyway, that's what I assumed that happened in the rest of the town. The bomb landed within 20 yards of the garden suburb pavilion. This is a recent photograph, in fact taken only 2 or 3 weeks ago. In October 41, it was used as a refuge for the bombed out, including those not just in the 6 houses that were badly damaged. Furniture like Mr. Sims' grand piano were also stored there, even though the roof was damaged. Today, the roof looks in good nick, as in fact does the whole building. But I've just recently read the Garden Suburb Minute Book for that year, and this is what it says, quickly. Moved by Mr. Taylor, and seconded by Mr. Collins, that Mr. Jones see that the roof re-damaged pavilion is made good immediately. So they were being put into a damaged pavilion, both people and eventually furniture, because it was next door to the bombed out buildings, houses. I also found this in the minutes. How quickly did they come to a decision to open the pavilion? Well, moved by that the committee fully endorse the throwing open of the pavilion for the bombed out tenants. And that was carried, of course, unanimously. So it would appear that that was done quite quickly. And I also came across this, that they sent a wreath to Mrs. Elder's funeral, which cost 8 shillings, which to those who don't know is 40 pence. A more significant sum then, of course. Remember the people of Oak Road, Holly Lane, 5th Avenue, Limeside, quarter midnight? Well, they nearly got it again. Only this time it was 20 past midnight. And this time it was Lilac Lane off Poplar Avenue, and there were 4 500-kilogram bombs. The official report says the first one created a crater 3 feet by 20 and fell in the road, slightly cracking it. It did not explode. The second created a crater 3 feet by 15 feet. It fell in the house back garden. An Anderson shelter was near and not affected. That also did not explode. The actual bomb causes damage, but these didn't explode. A third one, crater 8 feet by 3 feet, fell in a house garden. That didn't explode either. How fortunate could you be? But the fourth struck the side of a house, pulled down the side of that house, and was buried in a back garden. It severely damaged the house, but it too didn't explode. Derek Fenton told me that his grandma lived in Lilac Lane, and she was in an air raid shelter, the one where the bomb dropped in her back garden. In fact, as I've just said, none of them went off. He said, sloppy German workmen. I wondered if they were being made by slave labour. A lot of people were evacuated, of course, because all these bombs that hadn't exploded may have a delayed time fuse. There wasn't. And they were defused in part by the 77th Section of the Royal Engineers, helped by the Ferranti Home Guard Auxiliary Bomb Disposal Squad, and here they are. You'll see that the fuses have been removed. These chaps had had to dig 28 feet, almost 9 yards. That's how far these bombs will go, even though they don't explode, just the sheer velocity of them. They dug under Lilac Lane to find it, and there they brought it to the surface, and see, there they are. No wonder they look pleased. Or are they just relieved? The final 3 bombs fell around Frederick Street, Merton Avenue, Wolverton Avenue, Chamber Road area, sometimes called the Horrocks Field. Well, they all fell on open ground and made 2 large craters, one of them 40 feet, by 20 feet. That's a large crater. And 28 minutes later, the all clear sounded. It was 2 minutes to 1 o'clock on the 13th of October, 1941. The raid was over. But apart from the people in the town, did anyone know about what had happened? At the Public Record Office at Kew in 2016, I looked at the Cabinet Papers. And here's one of them. And you'll notice part way down, it says, the main target seems to have been Manchester, but bombs were dropped over a wide area, mainly in Lancashire and Cheshire. Enemy fighters operated on 5 nights during that week. On the night of the 12-13, when our bombers were operating in large numbers, 26 enemy fighters were engaged over this country. So while we were dropping bombs in Europe, their fighters, they say fighters, not bombers, were engaged here. And 5 enemy enemy aircraft were destroyed, 3 by night fighters. Then I also came across this under the heading damage, and you can see it says the most serious incidents occurred on the night of the 12th and 13th, when several houses were demolished in Manchester, Clayton, Denton and Oldham. And the casualties for the week ending 6 o'clock on the 15th of October, so it includes our what we've been talking about, are estimated at 61 killed and 69 seriously injured. 23 of the fatal casualties occurred at Oldham on the night of the 12th, 13th. And on another one, for the Minister of Home Security report, it says 13 people killed at Oldham and 200 rendered homeless. But who received all this information? Who's getting it? Well, I found this. There you have the lower part, casualties and damage, section 3. And look who's there. Winston Churchill, Clement Attlee, Anthony Eden, Lord Beaverbrook, Anderson of Anderson Shelter fame, Mr. Greenwood, Ernest Bevan, among others. So Winston Churchill would have been there as these reports were read. I wonder if, as his first constituency as an MP had been Oldham, whether he would have remembered those Oldham days some 40 years before. Or not, as the case may be. So, how to finish? Though I hope you've learned something, or been reminded of something, or smiled at what people recalled of those events, we must not forget that 27 people from our town died. They were casualties of war, just like military men and women, policemen and firemen. 10 years ago, just before that talk, Dory and I went to the World War I Tyne Cot Cemetery near Ypres. It is vast. There are 12,000 graves, 8,000 of which have no name, and there are on the walls 35,000 names being commemorated there. And as we left the car park and walked down the path to the entrance of the cemetery and to the little museum, we must have tripped some electronic beam, and a voice began reading the names of those remembered there. 10 years ago, I did the same in alphabetical order. Tonight I want to do the same, except in the order that they appear on the pages of the Oldham War Memorial. But I will add their name, their age and their address to their name. I will also include Amy Mills in April of 1942 of Grange Avenue, who is not mentioned on the Oldham War Memorial pages. The 12th of October. Harold Bradshaw, aged 62 of Frederick Street. Zipporah Elder, aged 82 of Green Lane. Amy Hughes, aged 46 of Incline Road. John Webster Hughes, aged 13 of Incline Road. Ethel Shaw, aged 32 of Cranberry Street. Peter Shaw, aged 8 of Cranberry Street. Ernest Joseph Taylor, aged 16 of Incline Road. Muriel Whittam, aged 4 of Cranberry Street. Esther Ann Bowden, aged 62 of Manley Road. George Bowden, aged 52 of Manley Road. Harriet Caffrey, aged 49, of Manley Road. John Thomas Eade, aged 52, of Cranberry Street. Rose Eade, aged 50, of Cranberry Street. Lily Jones, aged 33, of Murfield Avenue. Candice Jarrett, aged 39, of Murfield Avenue. Eileen Jarrett, aged 4, of Murfield Avenue. Fred Jarrett, aged 40, Murfield Avenue. Louisa Kershaw, 63, of Manley Road. James Marshall, aged 75, of Manley Road. Isabella Mills, aged 72, of Murfield Avenue. Florence Partington, aged 61, of Incline Road. Sadie Francis Raymond, aged 56, of Manley Road. John Stevenson, aged 34, of Cranberry Street. Catherine Stott, aged 40, of Oak Road. 15th of October. Edward Leatherbarrow, aged 41, of Hawksley Street. The 12th of November. Veronica McGarry, aged 51, of Coppice Street. And Amy Mills, aged 76, of Incline Road and Grange Road. They have not grown old, as we who are left have grown old. Age has not wearied them, nor the years condemned. Tonight, at the going down of the sun, exactly 80 years later, and in their town, we have remembered them. Thank you.